and welcome to this week's Tron Church podcast. Today we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of a Talking Points podcast chatting about the sermon, we're going to be discussing today the book about Gnosticism that's been our church big read recently, written by Nick Needham, published by the Christian Institute. My name's Agnes, and I'm joined today by Phil Copeland and Willie Phillip, and we're going to have a conversation about the book, which you may or may not have read, but hopefully this will be...
They've all read it, Agnes.
They've all read it?
Many times.
I'm so sorry, I got that wrong. This book that you have read, but we hope it will be helpful in you chewing it over a bit further on. Let me start by saying what does the book say? The book describes Gnosticism, which is an ancient heresy that said that matter, and therefore flesh, was bad and was a prison for the spirit, rather than seeing that we are body and soul, and both body and soul being good. And therefore Gnostics wanted to break those bounds that the flesh created. In all sorts of different ways, women defeminizing themselves, lesbianism, androgyny, and so on. And what Nick shows in the book is that we see it today in modern transgender ideology. So that's what the book does. But I guess my question is, why is it helpful for us to see that what we have today in transgender ideology is basically a form of ancient Gnosticism?
Well, I think there's a great comfort, and certainly this is one of the big things that really struck me from reading the paper, was that this is not new. I think often it's presented as something new. This transgender ideology is presented as not, by the way, even as an ideology, but as new scientific breakthrough. And I remember talking to some young people that I used to minister to in my previous church, and they just had this lesson in school, and it was put forward as here's this liberating thing for people who've struggled and who are trapped in the wrong body, and the inner you is the thing that really counts, and it doesn't matter, the outside is just a shell, and what you've got to do is listen to the inner you. And if the inner you says that you are female, but you've got a man's body, well, poor you need to liberate yourself from that. And this is science, and this is anything that counters this is evil and oppressive to any victim who's trapped in the wrong body. So to know actually that we can look back into the history of the church, which is the history of the translation of the Bible and of the history of ideas, and see that actually this is just something that's popped up before. It's not new. There's nothing new under the sun. And it exposes a real work of darkness and shows us actually how we're to think of it and respond to it as believers. This is not new. This is not scientific. And it's deeply against God and His Word.
I think that's really important, isn't it? It is not an advance in science. It is actually a regression into very ancient paganism. And that's really important. So it is an ideology. In other words, it is a religious belief. It's just a false religious belief. It's a corruption of truth. And a very absurd one at that. So if we've heard, it's not a new thing, is it, for people to say, I'm trapped inside the wrong body. We've got used to that with, for example, extremely emaciated, thin people feeling that they are trapped inside the body of a fat person. Now, nobody who is a clinician with the responsibility to help that particular person, nobody would be called anything other than an outrageous charlatan if they were to say, well, yes, indeed, let me help you to live out your belief in your inner fatness. You'd be struck off the medical register immediately, and rightly so. Well, there's an exact analogy here with that, isn't it? And so why can something equally absurd be acceptable? I mean, I just read this morning that President Biden in the States, commenting on, I think it's Florida, which is wanting to ban young girls from being able to have their breasts cut off and their genitals mutilated and so on in the name of transgender ideology. In other words, to protect vulnerable young children. President Biden has described that as near sinful.
Wow.
Now, the language that's being used tells you, doesn't it? This is not about science. That's not the language of science. That's the language of morality. It's the language of religion.
Mm-hmm.
But it is turning true religion, true belief, absolutely upside down, and calling evil that which is good, and calling good that which is evil.
Yes.
So how can something so absurd be held by so many people, and how can anybody who speaks against it be clamped down on, shouted down, ostracized, thrown out? Well, because it is a religious mania. That's the behavior of that kind of thing. This is the high priests of this ideology are calling people out and are setting the Inquisition upon it. So that's what it is. Yeah. And I think that's why seeing the roots in ancient Gnosticism is so helpful, because it shows us what it is. We're not dealing with a scientific thing. We're not dealing with a rational thing. We're dealing with a false belief. And I think we have to be absolutely clear about that.
And that's helpful, because I do think we often feel on the back foot a bit, don't we, with something that purports to be a new discovery, purports to have a scientific basis to it.
Yeah.
I mean, kids in schools, I think, are shown all sorts of diagrams as if it was some sort of scientific truth they're being told. And I think we can feel on the back foot, but actually these lies are as old as the hills, aren't they? They're as old as the Garden of Eden, and of course it's God's word that teaches us what's true about humanity and the whole creation.
And what Nick Needham helpfully shows in this book is that ancient Gnosticism was a rewriting of Genesis with everything back to front. So the God who creates the world is not good, but is bad and evil. Yeah. When humans rebel against this God, that's not a bad thing to do. It's liberation. So the serpent is the goody.
Yeah.
Because the serpent is the embodiment of Sophia, wisdom.
Yeah.
And the goddess of wisdom. So everything is back to front. The good is not God the Father who makes things. It's the feminine Sophia, and so on. And everything is reversed. And that's the epitome of what the Bible calls sin, isn't it? That's what Paul was talking about in Romans chapter 1. You turn the truth of God into a lie. That is, you turn your worldview upside down. And you call that which is evil good, and you worship not the creator, but the created thing. And so the created thing that you're worshipping in Gnosticism is the inner me. And the inner me needs to be liberated. And I liberate myself by discovering my true self. It's not a salvation that comes from outside, because we've sinned. It's a salvation that comes from us, because God's the baddie we've got to escape from. And of course, that's why any ideology like this appeals to human fallen sinful nature, because that's the essence of sin, is that I want to be God and I want to be in charge of myself. And so this, as with any other false teaching, just plays to our human weakness. And
it's interesting to think that at first blush it's a disagreement or a rejection of the doctrine of humanity, you might call it, what human beings are like.
Yeah.
But it goes beyond that, doesn't it? It's ultimately a rejection of God himself.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yes, because the biblical account, the biblical account of creation tells us that mankind is the crown of creation, and the crown of creation is in human beings made in the image of God. So God creates mankind. He creates them male and female, and only as male and female, in fact, is that image adequate, because when it's only the male, it's not good. Only when male and female together are there is it very good.
Yeah.
And so so an attack, a reversal or a destruction of that in every part is ultimately an attack on God himself. Attack God's image, you're attacking God. And so, first of all, we've seen the blurring of the roles of men and women, which is really an attack on God's original design of human beings as male and female. We've then seen a rejection of the specific sexual roles in terms of sexual activity, with the blurring of that in terms of normal sexual activity being perverted into same-sex activity. And then you go one step further, and you're now blurring even identity difference between male and female. And all of these are an attack directly on God himself. And of course, the next one is the blurring of a distinction between mankind and animals. And we're already beginning to see that in some jurisdictions where, marriage between a human and an animal is possible. And then it will be multiple human beings and multiple. But all of these ultimately are attacks on God himself. So efface the image of God in mankind, and you are spitting in the face of God himself. And that is the very heart of sin.
And that's the original sin, isn't it? So we shouldn't be at all surprised that we see a new version of an old version of that original rejection. Yep. Well, we were chatting earlier about another book that we've both read called Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey, which if folks want to read something chunkier than this, couldn't recommend a better book than Nancy Pearcey's. Could you just talk a little bit about that, what she calls a two-story version of truth, and how that plays into all of this?
Yeah, it is a very good book, and I do recommend it. And she picks up on something that Francis Schaeffer, I think, first described, which is that we've divided truth into an upper and a lower story. So he talks about the upper story being, for example, theology and morality. That is, in people's minds, things that are private and are relative and are subjective. But then on the lower story, you've got science, and that's public and that's objective and that's valid for everybody. And she goes through different ways in which we've sort of divided truth. So on one hand, you have an upper story of values. Well, again, that's the subjective and the private and so on. On the lower story, you've got facts, which again is meant to be objective and valid for everybody. Similarly with the Romantic tradition versus this sort of Enlightenment tradition. So the one leads to sort of subjectivism, postmodernism. The other leads to, the more rationalist modernism and so on. But this division of truth into these two things is quite significant. And she takes that on in terms of saying, well, that's what we've done in looking at the question of what does it mean to be human. So we've divided the person from the body. In other words, we've divided that which is to do with moral and legal rights and identity and so on from that which is biological and, if you like, more factual. So one has a sort of postmodern view of the self, that's the person, and that becomes very subjective and different for different people and so on, whereas the sort of more modernist view is remained of the body, so that's biological. So she would say, well, that the transgender ideology takes this subjective, more postmodern view of the person and separates that from the more objective factual view, if you like, of the body. And those two things are separate. And that's what allows you to say, well, I've got, the facts may be that I've got a male body, but actually my person, my subjective reality of who I am is that I'm, a female trapped inside a male's body or whatever. And I think that is really important, because that gets to the root of all these issues, because it's a separation of the person from bodily life. And you see, the biblical view is that we are created by God as embodied persons. From the moment of conception. The Bible speaks quite clearly that the life of the person begins. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. From the moment of conception, you're known by God. There is no separation ever between body and person.
When we taught this to the teenagers, we had them chant, "I'm not just body, I'm not just soul, I'm body and soul.
Yeah,
But that's so critically important, you see, because if you separate life and personhood, then, well, for example, the issue of abortion. Even nowadays, the most ardent pro-abortionists pretty much all admit that, yes, life begins at conception. It's become almost impossible now to deny that with 3D ultrasounds and the level of technology we've got. But you would think, well, therefore, that means people must surely say that to take a life from the womb must be wrong. And their answer is no, because it's not yet a person. It's a life, it's a human life, that's a biological fact, but it's not a human person, therefore it doesn't have the values, it doesn't have the identity, it doesn't have the legal standing, and so on. And so as soon as you divide those two things, you've got a major problem, because the question comes, well, when do you become a person? Now, some people will say, well, 24 or 28 weeks. But increasingly now you've got people saying, no,
a lot older.
Right up. Well, Hamza Yusuf has just said he wants to, if he becomes leader, promote sex selective abortion, so for no other reason than choosing the sex right up to birth. So until the day after birth, there's no longer a person. And in fact, you've got some who are pushing the boundary right out and want to say, well, you don't qualify as a person until puberty or even until adulthood.
I've heard about that, yeah.
So you can have infanticide right up until then. You see the same thing at the other end of the spectrum, because an old, decrepit, demented person, well, is still alive, but they're no longer really a person. So euthanasia, let's just do that. As soon as you make that divide, and that's the same divide that's going on here. My body may be a man's body, but my person is a woman. So it's very helpful to see that this is the root of so many of these issues that we're facing today. And it's that dualism that is there right back in Gnosticism.
And being able to see that, I think helps us to know that we're not trying. It's not progress. It's essentially an ideology, a worldview. Well, rebellious human beings in search of a justification for what they might want to do. Because I actually wonder whether one of the reasons that there's such opposition, there's such people are so in favour of abortion is because women are annoyed that they are the ones who have to carry the consequences of a pregnancy. Why should it be me? Why not him? He gets away with it, and it's trying to find a good reason for what I want to do anyway, what my sinful nature desires.
And on the other side of it, you have some men saying, well, why does she get to have the joy of having a baby and I don't? So why can't I? And, I want to be able to. It's a dissatisfaction, isn't it, with the embodied person that God has made me.
That's it.
So you have women who resent things that they don't have because they're not a man, and you have men resenting things that they don't have because they're not a woman. Rather than both rejoicing and giving thanks to God for what they do have as the imperfectly embodied part of the image of God that God has granted them to be. But that's the nature of sin, isn't it? We're not satisfied with what God has given us and made us. We want something different.
I listened to a few other podcasts, some of them secular podcasts, and it's been very interesting to me to listen to people who would object to transgender ideology very clearly, would see how irrational it is in lots of ways, but are very quick to say, oh, but I think same-sex relationships are okay. Don't hear me saying I'm opposed to homosexuality. What's going on there? What's that all about?
Phil, I think it's your turn.
Well, I think, and in fact, Nancy Pearcey's got a chapter on this in her book, where she takes the two-tier system of truth and applies it to all these different issues that we've been talking about: abortion, the hookup culture, and homosexuality. Because really, when you dig deep down, it's the same ideology that's underneath that. It's a rebellion against, rejection against how God has made me, rejection against the way my body's been made to function as a man. I've been created for sexual you know.
It's that for word, isn't it?
Yeah,
For.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Not with other men for sexual intimacy. Not with other men, but for sexual intimacy with a woman, my wife, and really to reject that. You know, if the inner person, the true inner person, is saying, well, actually, I am attracted to, I will be attracted to other men, then I'm going to go with that, because it doesn't matter externally if I've got a male body. You know, it's the same. You could take the same ideology and apply it to all these different things. But I wonder if just the point is, maybe we've reached a point, even maybe perhaps in the church, where we fail to recognise that actually this is what lies behind homosexuality.
Yeah.
And because we can see it clearly with the transgenderism, and we look at it, we know it's absurd. But I just wonder, maybe perhaps the amount of, I don't know, things we've been exposed to in the media and the voices and the lobbying for LGBT or yeah.
Yes, for marriage equality or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Has just made us not realise that that's also as absurd as this.
Yeah.
Nancy Pearcey, I think, really helpfully brings out the fact that Christian ethics, including Christian sexual ethics, represent the fact that there is she talks about it, the teleological reality of our nature. In other words, teleology is the end and the purpose. In other words, our design has a purpose. And I think this is the root of it. So where modernism, in the last century, essentially rejected God and wanted to explain everything within an atheistic worldview, that removes purpose. So Richard Dawkins, would be the epitome of that. There is no purpose to anything. It's just blind, pitiless indifference. Everything is chance. Yeah. So there is no purpose. So evolution, it's all just the selfish gene, but there's no purpose. There's no teleology. There's no great story.
You're not for.
You're not for something.
For, yeah.
So you evacuate purpose. And here's where you see, I think people are falling short, because they see the utter absurdity of the mismatch between biological reality and this kind of ideological fantasy of bodies being, identities trapped in their own bodies. But without the overarching understanding of the purpose of humanity, you still can't get the full picture. So you'll have people who say, well, you're not really trapped in the wrong body. You're not a woman trapped in a man's body. You're just a lesbian. But you see, you haven't got enough truth. You're only seeing part of the story, because the real truth about humanity needs to know not just what we are, but what we are for, and who we are for, and why we are what we are. So God's design for us is that we are for we're for Him. We're for enjoyment in Him, and we're for flourishing as human beings made in the image of God with the purpose of God. And so that's why that's not enough. Our biological reality is for a purpose. So, in fact, Nancy Pearcey tells in her book, in her chapter about homosexual practice, about somebody who was living as a practicing homosexual and then came to faith in Christ, and for a long time struggled with this, because they felt, well, how does this match? I believe the Bible. I believe Jesus. I want to follow that, but I can't match up with the fact the Bible's telling me the way I'm living is wrong. And he said that, but he then came to realize, no, wait a minute, I am made this way biologically for a purpose. I'm a man, and my man's body is for these sexual functions and these relations with females, not with males. And therefore, what I have to do is start living in line with reality. And living in line with my reality is not misusing my body sexually for same-sex sexual activity. It's for using it God's way. Properly, or not at all, as the Bible teaches. And so the gospel is, in that sense, the ultimate cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is about it's bringing people's thoughts, which are disordered and thinking wrongly and drawing wrong conclusions, and bringing them back to living in line with actual reality. That's the ultimate. The gospel is the ultimate bringing back to live in line with reality. Yes. And so it's not enough to say, no, you're not trapped in the wrong body, you're just a lesbian. It's, no, you're not trapped in the wrong body, you're not a lesbian, you are a woman. Yeah. And this is what a woman's body is for. And this is what being a woman is for. And so you're not going to find salvation by rejecting your womanhood, rejecting being a mother, rejecting that's what the Gnostics did. No, that diminishes womanhood. That enslaves you. That truncates the beauty of what God has created. No, you find yourself by finding what God has made you. And you find that by submitting to God's truth and saying, well, no, actually, this is the way. And that's what Paul means, by the way, when he says women will be saved through childbirth. Yeah. He's not meaning you can only be saved if you have children. What he's saying is women will be saved by being the women that God has created them to be, which is women who are created. Not every woman will be a mother, but that's
but not trying to be
not
other than what you're made to be.
Yeah. Precisely. So the liberation there is, the wonderful liberation is, you don't have to be somebody else. Be who God has created you to be, and what He's created you to be. The clue is in your body. Yeah. And it's not that difficult. So that purpose, that teleology, is so important, because if we don't know what human beings are for, we don't know what human beings are.
No.
And only God, obviously, the maker of those human beings, can speak with clarity on it. And it's just wonderful to think that we've been, He's not left us in the dark about these things. Yeah. He speaks very clearly, foundationally, in Genesis about who we are and what we are, and therefore how we can flourish. Yeah.
If we don't know what we're for and who we are for, we will not know what we are or who we are. And the answers to those questions cannot be found in science alone, because science is bounded by this world. Science is the study of this world. The study of this world and the study of nature and science can point us to the reality which lies beyond this. And our bodies tell a story. They tell us part of the story. They tell us, what they're there to do and how we live in line with that. But we need a revelation from the one who made us to tell us the full wonder of that and where it's all going. And that's why we've got so much of a better story to tell.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
And it's a terrible tragedy, isn't it, to think that somehow you can enhance somebody's humanity by cutting pieces of it off and by mutilating it.
Or to think that it's repressive to tell someone to say no to their homosexual temptations.
Yes.
It can't be repressive to tell someone to go along with what they're made for.
Or indeed their heterosexual temptations.
True.
Or any temptations.
Any temptations at all.
Because every desire that we have has to be channeled according to its true purpose. And when Paul's talking about these things to Corinthians, he's saying, it's not food for the body and the body for food, but it's for the Lord. The body is the answer. The answer is not that the body is either for sex or for something else, or either for this form of sex or that. The answer is that the body is for the Lord. Our whole life is for the Lord, and so our physical existence, our sexual lives, our social lives, our sporting lives, our work lives, every aspect of our life ultimately is for the Lord. And we're made for the glory of God. We're made to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And those two things, John Piper is so right to connect those two things together. Those are not two separate things. God is most glorified in us. No, what is it? God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. That's the way he puts it. And I think we
glorify God by enjoying Him forever.
And we enjoy Him by glorifying Him, not by rebelling against Him. We will not have a satisfied life ultimately. And the ultimately is important because you can delude yourself for a long time into thinking you've got a very satisfied life. But the day is going to come when you're going to be put into a coffin. And the Bible tells us, well, that's on that day you're going to discover the reality of life. And the tragedy is that the wicked has no future. Those who have rebelled against God have no future. But the righteous, even in their death, will discover the true flourishing of life. But, we discover that now.
And those who belong to Christ, who've had genuine struggles in this whole area of sexual temptation, or struggle with the body that they are and have, will be made right. And will be released from that on that day, on that judgment
And the
day.
release will not be that we're released from our body.
No.
The release is that our body will be redeemed. And that this comes to the heart of the Christian faith, because the incarnation of the Lord Jesus tells us that bodily life is not inferior. Is not God became man, and the resurrection of Jesus reinforces that in triplicate, because he did not rise from his body, he rose in his body. And his body was the same, was recognizable, was the same man. And I do think that means, and I think Nick Needham talks about this, that gender distinctions are not temporary, they're eternal. Jesus was still a man, he didn't come back as androgynous.
They're fundamental.
Yeah.
But it was, he was recognizable, he was the same man, but he was the glorified man. He was more solid and more human. And that's what we are made for. That's the joy of understanding the gospel. So, as with most things, it comes right back. The reality, the truth, comes right back to the very heart of the gospel, and the person and work of Jesus Christ, who is God and man. And liberation is for us is to realize that in him we will find that true humanity.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to round up our discussion. Thanks for joining us for today's podcast.